All right, welcome to another deep dive. I've got to say, when you gave me this book on traumatic brain injury, methods for clinical and forensic neuropsychiatric assessment by Robert Granicher, the title itself, well, it's a mouthful.
It's a dense one, that's for sure.
It is. But, I'm always up for a challenge.
You are.
And I am ready to jump into this with you.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
This book really digs deep into how, medical professionals go about assessing TBI.
Right.
Both for treatment and this is where it gets really interesting, for all those kind of, tricky legal cases.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack.
There is. And the book starts out with this statistic. 2 million.
Wow.
Traumatic brain injuries in the U.S. every single year.
It's a huge number.
It is.
2 million.
2 million. I mean, what's going on here? Are we all just walking around bumping into things constantly?
Well, I mean, I've definitely bumped my head a few times getting out of the car.
Sure.
But it's not quite that simple. What's interesting here is it's not, just clumsy people or contact sports or anything like that. The book points out that the highest rates of TBI are actually in two really different age groups. So you've got young adults, between 15 and 24.
Yeah.
And then older adults, over 75.
Interesting. So risky behavior when you're younger, and then as we get older, more falls.
Exactly.
Right.
So think about it. It could potentially affect, a lot of us or someone we know at some point in our lives.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about you bump your head, you get a bruise, walk it off.
Yeah.
The book says almost 100,000 people a year end up with chronic brain impairment.
Yeah. And that's really what makes understanding TBI so important.
Okay.
Because it's not just a physical injury that you kind of bounce back from,
Right, right.
There's this whole cascade of events that happens in the brain after trauma.
Okay.
That can have lasting effects.
So break it down for me. I mean, what's actually happening inside the brain when we talk about TBI?
So picture this.
Okay.
You hit your head. Ouch, right.
Yeah.
But that initial impact, that's just the beginning of the story.
Oh.
You've got swelling, potentially bleeding, and the book even talks about how the trauma itself can trigger neurodegeneration. So that's the gradual loss of brain cells over time.
It's like a domino effect.
It is.
You hit your head, and then all these other things start to happen.
Exactly. The initial injury sets off this chain reactions, like a domino effect. And to add to that whole, storm in the brain, you've got things like free radicals and inflammation that happen after the injury.
Right.
And these can really contribute to long-term damage.
So it's not just the physical damage, but it's all these secondary effects that make things so much more complicated. It's like, okay, so you bump your head, but inside there's this whole unseen storm brewing.
That's a great way to put it. A lot more complex than most people realize.
Yeah. And I'm already feeling my head spin a little bit, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Right.
So how do doctors even begin to untangle all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, how do they figure out what's going on with a patient after a potential TBI?
Well, it's kind of like a detective investigating a case, right?
Okay.
They need to gather clues and piece things together. And the book talks about this system, a widely used system called the Glasgow Coma Scale.
GCS.
GCS, exactly.
Okay.
Like a short.
I've heard that term, but I don't really know what it means. So is it like a test?
It is a type of assessment, but it's actually pretty straightforward. The GCS looks at three main things.
Okay.
Can you open your eyes?
Okay.
Can you talk? And can you move your arms and legs?
Got it.
And they score each of these, based on the patient's response.
So it's a way to quickly assess how the brain is functioning right after the injury happens.
Exactly. It gives doctors that initial snapshot of the severity.
Okay.
So a high score on the GCS means you're more likely to have a milder injury. Okay.
While a lower score could signal something, potentially more serious.
Got it. That makes sense. But the book goes beyond just this GCS score, right?
It does.
It talks about all kinds of other assessments, like imaging.
Yeah.
Which sounds really high tech.
Absolutely. Imaging plays a crucial role in diagnosing and understanding the extent of the damage.
Right.
So you've probably heard of CT scans, right?
Yeah, like those are basically x-rays, but for your brain, right?
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay.
CT scans fall under what we call structural imaging,
Okay.
which lets doctors see the actual physical damage. So skull fractures, areas of bleeding, and those scary sounding hematomas, which are basically blood clots inside the skull.
Okay, so like taking a picture of the battlefield, so to speak.
Exactly.
But the book also mentions these other types of imaging, like SPECT, TEAD, and fMRI. What are those all about?
So those are what we call functional imaging.
And they're really cool because they go beyond just the physical damage and show how the brain is actually working.
Wow.
So imagine seeing like a traffic jam in the brain. That's what functional imaging helps us do, revealing those areas where brain activity is disrupted,
Oh, wow.
even if a CT scan looks normal.
So it's like your car might look fine after a fender bender, but under the hood, there could be all sorts of problems that are affecting performance.
That's a perfect analogy, and this is especially important in those cases of mild TBI, where the structural damage might be pretty subtle, but the functional impact can be significant.
Right. So it's like the engine sputtering, even though the car looks intact from the outside.
Exactly.
Wow. This is all really eye-opening.
It is.
So we've got the initial impact, the secondary effects, all these different ways to assess the damage. But the book doesn't stop there, does it? It goes into this whole neuropsychiatric impact of TBI, which just sounds kind of intimidating.
It is a complex area, but it's incredibly important. We have to remember that TBI extends far beyond just the physical. It can affect a person's thinking, their emotions, and their behavior.
Right.
In really profound ways.
Okay, so what kinds of changes are we talking about here?
Well, think about things like attention and memory.
Okay.
After a TBI, someone might have trouble concentrating, remembering recent events, or even just following a conversation.
Yeah, so basic things that we
Sure.
take for granted
Absolutely.
can suddenly become really big challenges.
Exactly, and it goes even further than that. The book talks about how TBI can affect language and speech.
Okay.
So someone might have trouble finding the right words or articulating their thoughts or even understanding complex language. Imagine trying to have a conversation, but the words just won't come out right.
Right.
Or you can't quite grasp what someone else is saying.
That would be incredibly isolating and frustrating.
It is, and it can be very difficult for people to cope with.
And the book keeps going.
Right, it does.
It goes on to talk about visuospatial abilities being affected.
Yes, and that's all about how we perceive and interact with the world around us, right?
Right.
So TBI can impact spatial awareness, making things like navigation
Yeah.
or even recognizing familiar faces difficult. It's like your brain is struggling to make sense of all the visual information that it's receiving.
It's almost like being in a foreign country
Yes.
where you don't speak the language or understand the customs.
Exactly.
You're constantly trying to catch up, but everything just feels a little bit off.
That's a really good way to put it. And we can't forget about executive function, which is controlled by the frontal lobes of the brain. This is all about our higher level thinking skills,
Okay.
planning, decision-making, impulse control, things that are so crucial for our daily lives. TBI can disrupt these abilities, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming.
So it's not just about remembering where you put your keys.
Right.
It's also about making decisions, controlling your impulses, and basically, managing your everyday life.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really challenging because these neuropsychiatric consequences, they aren't always obvious from the outside.
Right.
You can't necessarily see them on a CT scan or an MRI.
So how do doctors actually measure these less obvious effects?
That's a great question. It's not like you can just ask someone, hey, how's your executive function today?
Right. Right.
Well, you could ask, but you wouldn't get very reliable results.
Sure.
So that's where neuropsychological tests come in.
Okay. What are those like?
They're actually pretty fascinating. They're like puzzles and games designed to assess different cognitive skills.
Okay.
And they're tailored to different age groups.
Interesting.
So, for example, there's the Dellis-Kaplan Executive Function System, which is used for adults, and then the NEPSY, which is designed for children.
Oh, okay.
And these tests provide a way to objectively measure the impact of TBI on thinking abilities.
So it's not just about asking someone how they feel. There are actual tools to measure these cognitive impacts.
Exactly. There are. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The book also delves into the connection between TBI and mental health.
Oh, wow.
Which is a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah, I can only imagine the emotional toll that a brain injury takes on a person.
It's significant. TBI dramatically increases the risk of developing mental health disorders.
Okay.
Things like depression, anxiety, and even PTSD, especially in cases where the injury was caused by violence or a traumatic event. Imagine going through something like a car accident or a violent assault. The trauma itself can leave these lasting emotional scars.
Yeah, it's like your brain has been through a war zone and is trying to process the aftermath.
That's a powerful way to put it. And the book really emphasizes that TBI has these ripple effects that go far beyond just the initial injury. It impacts both mental and physical well-being.
This has been so insightful, but I gotta say, a little bit overwhelming. I had no idea how much TBI could affect a person's life on so many different levels.
It is a complex injury with really far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
But understanding the full scope of TBI, that's a first step toward providing appropriate support and care.
Well, on that note, I think we need to pause here for a moment and let all this information sink in. But when we come back, we'll shift gears and explore the legal side of TBI. How do these assessments play out in legal cases, and what are some of the challenges involved? Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back. And I have to admit, like thinking about TBI in the context of legal cases just adds another whole layer to this already complicated issue.
It does. And this book really dives headfirst into that whole world, exploring the role of neuropsychiatric assessments in these TBI cases. It's a minefield, to say the least.
I can imagine we've already talked about how tricky it can be just to diagnose TBI, especially these milder cases where the imaging might look totally normal, but the person's still experiencing these, real cognitive and emotional challenges.
Yeah.
So how do you even prove that in a court of law?
Right. Well, that's the million-dollar question, and it's one of the biggest challenges the book really tackles, proving causation.
Okay.
That direct link between an accident and these sometimes invisible brain injuries.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult. You might have, symptoms, cognitive difficulties, changes in personality, but if the damage isn't like readily apparent on a scan,
Right.
it can become this battle of he said, she said.
So proving TBI in court sounds like navigating a minefield.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to establish that clear link between an accident and these invisible brain injuries?
It really becomes a case of building a strong case, based on really thorough documentation, detailed assessments, and a really deep understanding of the patient's history. This is where those neuropsychological tests that we talked about become absolutely crucial. They provide this objective evidence of cognitive impairments that can be linked back to the time of the injury.
So it's like piecing together a puzzle, using all of these different pieces of information like medical records, test results, and the patient's own account of their experience to create this complete picture of the impact of the TBI.
Exactly. And it's not just about proving that the TBI occurred, it's also about assessing the damages.
Okay.
This means putting a dollar amount on the impact of the injury, which is another incredibly complex challenge.
Putting a price tag on a brain injury, that sounds almost impossible.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to quantify the impact on someone's life? Their ability to work their potential future earnings or their need for, ongoing care.
It's one of the most difficult aspects of TBI litigation.
Yeah.
You're essentially trying to put a value on someone's quality of life, their potential, their future, and it requires expertise, a deep understanding of the long-term consequences of TBI, and the ability to project how those consequences are going to play out over time.
And I imagine there's always the risk of, someone exaggerating their symptoms for financial gain. That must make things even more complicated.
That's another aspect that the book really digs into. It's called malingering. And it's a legitimate concern in these cases. Fortunately, there are tools to help identify those who might be exaggerating or fabricating their symptoms.
So it's like a lie detector test for the brain.
Yeah, in a way.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how these tools work.
Well, one example is the MMPI-2. It's a psychological test that has these built-in validity scales that are designed to detect inconsistencies in someone's responses. So it's like a built-in lie detector. And then there are also these specialized effort tests that assess whether someone is genuinely putting forth their best effort during these cognitive assessments.
So it's like a detective game trying to piece together the objective evidence with the subjective experience, all while considering potential biases and motivations.
It's a really delicate balance requiring expertise, a keen eye for detail, and a deep understanding of both the medical and legal aspects of TBI.
I'm starting to see why this book really focuses so heavily on assessment methods. Accurate evaluation is kind of the foundation for everything that follows, whether it's treatment or legal proceedings or just simply understanding the full scope of the injury.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the immediate aftermath. The book stresses the importance of long-term monitoring because some consequences of TBI, They might not emerge until months or even years later.
That's a little bit scary.
Right.
So even if someone seems okay after an accident,
Right.
they could still be at risk down the line.
Exactly.
What kinds of delayed consequences are we talking about?
Well, it varies from person to person, but some common issues that can emerge later include things like cognitive decline, personality changes, increased risk of mental health disorders, and even a higher susceptibility to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
That's concerning. What can be done to kind of mitigate those risks?
Early intervention is key. It's crucial to educate patients about these potential delayed effects and encourage them to seek medical attention if they notice any new symptoms or changes in their cognitive abilities.
This is all reminding me of a story. My friend's dad had this seemingly minor head injury years ago, but just recently started having memory problems and personality changes. They thought he was just getting older, but now they're wondering if it could be related to that old injury.
That's not uncommon, unfortunately, and it highlights why ongoing research into the long-term effects of TBI is so vital.
Yeah.
We're still learning so much about this complex interplay of factors that contribute to these delayed consequences.
It's almost like the brain is a mystery. We're slowly uncovering, one piece at a time.
A fitting analogy, and with TBI, it's a mystery with very real human stakes. Every injury, every case is unique, and understanding that individuality is really at the heart of this book's message.
So what does this all mean for someone who is, navigating a TBI, whether they're a patient or a family member or a medical professional? What are the key takeaways from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is awareness. Awareness of the complexity of TBI, the long-term implications, the challenges of diagnosis, and the need for really comprehensive individualized care.
It's about seeing the whole person, not just the injury.
Yes.
Understanding that TBI affects not just the individual, but their family, their work, their entire life.
That's beautifully put.
And advocating for those affected by TBI.
Right.
Ensuring they have access to the resources and the support that they need to really navigate this often unpredictable journey of recovery.
Absolutely.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
I feel like I've gained a much deeper appreciation for the multifaceted nature of TBI.
Yeah.
So much more than just a bump on the head.
It really is.
It's this complex interplay of physical, cognitive, emotional, and even legal factors.
And as we wrap up, I think the most important takeaway is that TBI is not a one-size-fits-all condition.
Right.
Every individual's experience is unique, requiring a tailored approach to assessment, treatment, and support.
It's about recognizing the human impact, the individual stories behind the statistics.
Beautifully said.
Well, on that note of hope and future possibilities, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the complexities of TBI, from the initial injury to the long road to recovery.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of TBI and perhaps a sense of hope and empowerment. If you have any concerns about TBI, please reach out to your doctor. There are resources available, and knowledge is the first step toward getting the help you need.
Remember, early intervention and a comprehensive approach can make a world of difference in the journey of recovery.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those curious minds engaged. We'll see you on the next deep dive. All right, so we're back and ready to explore what I think is the more hopeful side of TBI.
Yeah.
The treatments and therapies that are actually helping people recover and rebuild their lives.
Definitely a more optimistic note.
Yeah.
After that, pretty deep dive into all the complexities and challenges.
Right. So paint me a picture. What are those approaches? What are the treatments that are out there?
Well, the first thing to remember is that treatment for TBI, it's not one size fits all.
Right.
It's very much individualized, depending on how severe the injury is, the specific parts of the brain that are affected, and really the person's individual needs and goals.
So it's not like there's this standard TBI protocol that everybody follows.
Exactly. It's really about tailoring that treatment to the person. But generally speaking, there are two main categories, right?
Okay.
You've got your medical interventions, which often involve medications.
Okay.
And then you've got therapies that focus more on rehabilitation and kind of retraining the brain.
So let's start with medications. I mean, are there drugs out there that can actually help heal the brain after a TBI?
That's the big question. And it's definitely an area of active research.
Yeah.
Currently, there's no medication that can magically reverse brain damage.
Right.
But there are drugs that can help manage those symptoms and potentially protect the brain from further damage.
Okay, so more about managing the impact than like a cure.
Right, right.
What kind of medications are we talking about here?
Well, one example that the book highlights is the use of medications that target something called the cholinergic system.
Okay.
Remember we talked about how TBI can disrupt acetylcholine?
Yeah, that neurotransmitter that's so important for attention and memory.
Exactly. And the book actually points out that this disruption, this cholinergic disruption, it might even contribute to those long-term changes like neurodegeneration.
Oh, wow.
So researchers are looking at medications that can boost those acetylcholine levels or enhance its activity in the brain.
So it's not just about managing the symptoms, but it's also about trying to protect the brain from further damage down the line.
That's the goal, and it's a pretty exciting area of research. And then there are also medications that can help with other common TBI symptoms, like sleep disturbances, headaches, mood disorders, all those things that can really impact a person's quality of life.
So the medication piece is really about providing that support and relief
Yeah.
while the brain is healing
Mm.
and hopefully, preventing further damage.
Exactly.
But what about those therapies that you mentioned? What do those involve?
This is where things get really interesting. Cognitive rehabilitation therapies. They're kind of like physical therapy, but for the brain.
Okay.
So they involve, these structured exercises and activities that are designed to retrain those cognitive skills that have been affected by the TBI.
So like learning to walk again, but for your brain.
Exactly. And just like physical therapy, it takes time, it takes effort, and a personalized approach to really see results. These therapies can focus on a whole range of cognitive functions, including attention, memory, language, executive function, even social skills. Really, it depends on the individual's needs.
Can you give me an example of what one of these therapies might look like?
Sure. Imagine, someone who's having trouble with memory after TBI.
Okay.
So the therapist might work with them on strategies for remembering information,
Yeah.
like using visual cues, breaking tasks down into those smaller steps, or just practicing, repetition and rehearsal.
Right.
They might even use computer programs or, games that are designed to challenge and strengthen those memory skills.
So it's like a mental workout,
Yeah.
building up those cognitive muscles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is. And these therapies are constantly evolving as researchers are learning more about the brain and how it heals.
Okay.
There are also therapies that focus on those emotional and behavioral challenges,
Right.
helping individuals really cope with the psychological impact of the TBI, which can be significant.
It's really encouraging to hear about all these advancements. I mean, it gives me hope for, the future of TBI treatment and recovery.
It's a rapidly evolving field, and the book really emphasizes that, continued research is key here to unlocking those new possibilities. We're only just beginning to understand the brain's incredible capacity for healing and adaptation.
This deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to the world of TBI. It's so much more than just a bump on the head.
It is.
It's this really complex interplay of physical, cognitive, emotional, and even legal factors like we've discussed.
And as we're wrapping up here, I think the most important takeaway is that TBI is not, this one-size-fits-all condition. Every individual's experience is unique. It requires this really tailored approach to assessment, treatment, and support.
It's about recognizing the human impact,
Yeah.
the individual stories behind the statistics.
Beautifully said.
Well, on that note of hope and future possibilities, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey, exploring the complexities of TBI from the initial injury to that long road to recovery.
It really has. It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of TBI and perhaps even, a sense of hope and empowerment. If you have any concerns about TBI, please reach out to your doctor. There are resources available, and knowledge is the first step toward getting the help you need.
Remember, early intervention and a comprehensive approach can make a world of difference in that journey of recovery.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
Keep diving.
And keep those curious minds engaged. We'll see you on the next deep dive.